Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including The Watcher of the Vault, The Shingled Respiration, The Audit of Room 402, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Watcher of the Vault. Dearest Elias, I am writing this because my voice feels heavy in my throat, and you always told me that words are easier to carry than memories. If you find this letter on your bedside table, please know that I am safe, or at least, I am currently out of its reach. You remember the Grand Atrium Aquarium? The one where we spent our summers watching the jellyfish pulse like floating lanterns? I was hired as a night custodian there last month, and it was during those midnight shifts that I discovered the gap in the night. It is a pocket of time, a literal fracture in the chronology of the world, where no stars will ever grow. It exists between the stroke of midnight and the first heartbeat of morning, a vacuum where time forgets to move forward. At first, it was just a silence so profound it felt like a weight on my eardrums. But then I saw it moving among the tanks. The entity doesn't swim or walk in the way we expect. It moves with a rhythmic, fluid glide, its body composed of what looks like woven wet silk and iridescent scales that shimmer even in the dim light. It is not a ghost, but a presence from the gap. What makes it truly unsettling is how it perceives us. While I walked the corridors, it followed me at a constant distance, never speeding up to catch me and never slowing down to let me pull away. But its posture was the most peculiar thing about it. It doesn't face forward like a human does. Instead, its torso hinges backward at the waist, allowing its head and shoulders to point toward the ceiling while its body remains oriented toward my feet. It watches the rafters with a constant, hungry gaze, yet it tracks my every step as if it were reading a map written on my skin. I remember one night, standing by the Great Reef tank when I dared to speak to it. "Are you watching me?" I whispered into the humid air. The entity didn't turn its face toward me. It remained hinged backward, its heavy head tracking the swirling dust motes above, yet I felt its presence press against my spine like a warm thumb. It is a creature of the gap, a dweller in that starless void where minutes don't accumulate into hours. As the weeks passed, the entity grew bolder. It began to mimic the sounds of the water, the low hum of bubbles, and the crackle of sand, but it did so with a slight delay, as if it were practicing our world's music. I started to feel its weight in the room even when I couldn't see it clearly. One Tuesday, during the deepest part of the shift, the silence broke. The entity stopped its fluid gliding and stood perfectly still at the end of the kelp forest gallery. It was so close now that I could see the texture of its skin. It looked like hammered copper dipped in oil. It stayed hinged backward, staring at a flickering overhead light with such intensity that its scales began to vibrate. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. The gap was expanding. For a moment, I thought it might finally turn forward to face me, to lock our gazes and pull me into the starless void where time stands still. But it didn't. It simply stayed there, watching the ceiling while my own shadow seemed to stretch toward it like an invitation. When the morning shift finally arrived and the humans flooded in with their noise and heat, the entity retreated into the deepest trench of the Great Reef. I can still feel its presence when I close my eyes. It isn't just a creature. It is the keeper of the missing time, the thing that waits for the world to stop turning so it can finally look down at us. My final advice to you, if you ever find yourself in a room where the silence feels heavy enough to touch, don't be afraid of the things you can see. Be afraid of the things that are watching the ceiling while they wait for you to notice them. The Shingled Respiration. I am recording this because the silence is becoming heavy, and I need a way to anchor my thoughts before they drift away completely. The power went out 3 days ago, but it didn't just take the lights. It seemed to take the scale of the world. My house feels smaller now, yet somehow deeper. When I first sat down in the living room with this memo app, the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of my own pulse. But as the hours passed, that pulse began to sync with a different rhythm, a slow, tectonic heave that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't just a house anymore. It felt like I was a single, conscious thought traveling through the mind of something gargantuan and slumbering. Every time I move, there is a subtle displacement, as if my chair is resting on a vast, slightly yielding muscle rather than a floorboard. The air has changed too. It doesn't smell like dust anymore. It tastes of an ancient attic, a thick, velvety powder that coats the back of my throat with every breath. I can feel it settling on my skin, a fine silt of memories from somewhere very old. Then, there was the first sound of the wings. It wasn't a flap, but a grinding slide, like heavy velvet being pulled over stone. I looked up and saw them, layers of moth wings, overlapping like roof shingles, covering the ceiling in a mosaic of mottled browns and iridescent ochres. They aren't moving much, but they are shifting, expanding to fill every corner of the room. It feels as though the house is merely the ribcage of this creature, and I am tucked deep inside its chest cavity. Are you awake yet? I whispered into the memo app, my voice sounding thin against the vastness. The response was a vibration rather than a sound, a low, humming frequency that made the floorboards hum like a cello string. It felt as if the entity was dreaming of me. Every time I blink, I feel the weight of its attention. It isn't watching me with eyes, it is perceiving me through its entire surface area. The wings are beginning to pulse now, shedding tiny flakes of iridescent dust that dance in the gloom. Each flake carries a faint warmth, like a dying ember. Stay still, I told myself, but my own body felt heavy, as if the gravity of the creature's sleep was pulling at my marrow. The sensation is overwhelming, the realization that my entire life, my house, and my furniture are merely tiny details in this massive, breathing organism. It breathes out a cloud of attic-scented air, and for a moment, I am submerged in it, feeling the texture of its thoughts. It is thinking of the weight of mountains. It is thinking of the slow passage of seasons. And here I am, a flickering spark of awareness in its massive, velvet-covered brain. The wings are starting to fold inward now, drawing closer to my face, the shingle-like edges overlapping until they form a protective canopy over my head. The hum has reached a crescendo, a steady, thrumming vibration that resonates in my teeth. I can feel the entity beginning to stir, its massive body shifting a fraction of an inch deeper into the earth. It is no longer just sleeping, it is starting to recognize the small thing inside its ribs. I felt a sudden, sharp contraction, a massive inhale that pulled the air from my lungs and replaced it with the taste of old wood and moth dust. The house groaned as the creature settled into a new posture of rest. I reached out a hand to touch one of the nearest wings, feeling the papery texture under my fingertips. It was cool, yet vibrating with hidden energy. Don't wake me, it seemed to sigh through the walls. I held my breath, afraid that even a single exhale might disturb its monumental peace. Then, the movement stopped completely. The vibration leveled out into a perfect, haunting stillness. But just as I began to relax, the taste of dust intensified, and I felt the floor beneath me tilt just slightly toward the center of the room. The creature wasn't just sleeping anymore. It had finally noticed that I was there, and it was deciding whether or not to open its eyes. The Audit of Room 402. I was told by the late Dr. Aristone that my task was simple. Perform a manual audit of the cold storage room every Tuesday at midnight. It was a job of inventory, a way to ensure the frost hadn't claimed any secrets. But as I sat in that heavy silence with my clipboard, I realized that the morgue had a secret of its own. The first time I entered, it felt like any other clinical space. Row upon row of metal tables held the quiet inhabitants of the city. There was no movement, only the hum of the refrigeration units and the sharp, medicinal scent of formaldehyde. Then I noticed the mole. It was tucked into corner B, a small, hunched shape huddled beneath a hanging light. It didn't have a name, but it had a presence. It wore the face of the last tenant, a woman named Alara who had been admitted 3 days prior. However, the face felt wrong. It wasn't her skin, it was more like a piece of heavy, textured parchment stretched over a skull. The eyes were slightly too wide, and the mouth was frozen in a permanent O shape as if she were perpetually about to gasp. Every time I turned my back to record a body count, the mole moved. It didn't walk, it slid with a rhythmic, wet friction, like a heavy rug being dragged over stone. On the second night, when I reached for my pen, I felt a sudden draft from the far end of the room. When I looked up, the mole was no longer in corner B. It was now at the foot of table 12. Its body was long and segmented, resembling a polished mahogany cabinet with joints like those of an insect. It didn't have limbs so much as protrusions, thick, velvet-covered humps that rippled as it glided. The face remained Alara's, but it sat atop the strange, wooden torso like a mask glued to the front of a wardrobe. On the third night, I started to dread the moment my back turned. Each time I looked away, the mole migrated closer. It moved with a deliberate, predatory grace. By the fifth night, it was halfway down the aisle. It no longer stayed in one spot for more than a minute. It began to move while I watched, its mahogany body undulating like a slow-motion wave. The face of Alara seemed to change as well. The edges of her skin started to fray at the corners, revealing a glimpse of the raw, amber-colored wood beneath. On the seventh night, I stopped trying to write. I stood in the center of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every time I blinked, the mole closed the gap. It was now just 3 feet away. Its face hovered at chest height. The expression on Alara's face started to shift, not her features, but the way the mask sat on the wood. The mouth widened, and the skin of her cheeks began to sag toward the floor. I realized then that it wasn't just a body with a face, it was a scavenger of identity. It took the last thing to die and wore its history like a costume. On the 10th night, the audit became an endurance test. The mole was no longer moving when I looked away. It was waiting for me to look at it. Every time my eyes met Alara's face, she moved an inch closer. It was a game of inches. By the final night, I stood trembling in the center of the room. The hum of the fridge seemed to die down, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I took one deep breath and closed my eyes for 3 seconds. When I opened them, the mole was directly in front of me. It was so close that the scent of old cedar and damp earth filled my nostrils. Alara's face was no longer just a mask. It had begun to stretch over the wooden torso like a melting wax sculpture. The corners of her mouth pulled back further, revealing not teeth, but tiny, polished knobs of wood. It reached out with its closest protrusion, a smooth, rounded hump that felt like a thumb, and touched my chin. Then, in a terrifying motion, the face began to peel away from the wood, sliding down toward the floor like a shedding skin. As I watched, it left behind a new surface, a raw, blank face of polished mahogany, waiting for its next tenant. The manual for the scent of yesterday. To the night shift maintenance crew, you are holding the operational manual for the Great Bottling Hall. For 80 years, this factory has been the heartbeat of the city's glassworks, but it is currently in a state of lights-out hibernation. The machines are silent, the conveyor belts are frozen, and the air is thick with the metallic tang of cold iron and old grease. You are permitted to enter for repairs, provided you follow one absolute rule: do not switch on the overhead lamps after 10 p.m. When the sun retreats, the hall belongs to the scent. The phenomenon began as a peculiar anomaly during the initial sealing of the plant in 1944. The workers noticed that despite no human being present for months, a heavy, suffocating aroma of crushed violets and damp earth would seep from the central vat. It was a stranger's perfume, a lingering ghost of a woman who had stood in the center of the room on the final day of production. But as the years passed, the scent became more than a memory. It became a physical weight, a tangible pressure against the eardrums. During your first hour of the night shift, you will hear nothing but the hum of your own breath and the occasional groan of settling beams. The silence is not empty, it is expectant. However, as you move toward the central vat, the perfume will intensify until it feels like silk ribbons wrapping around your throat. It starts as a faint tickle in the nostrils, then deepens into a velvety shroud that coats every surface, the iron pillars, the glass shards on the floor, and even the very fabric of your uniform. This is when you must watch the floor. The entity does not have a face or limbs in the traditional sense. It is a towering silhouette composed entirely of pressed, dead flowers, marigolds, roses, and baby's breath, all flattened into rigid, velvet layers. It does not walk so much as it accumulates. As it moves across the stone floor, it sheds its petals. Each step leaves a perfect cluster of dried flora behind, marking its path like a trail of falling confetti in a winter garden. You will hear a soft, rhythmic rustle, the the sound of paper rubbing against paper as the figure glides toward you. It is a dry, papery music that seems to originate from both inside and outside your own head. Do not be fooled by its stillness. When it moves, the perfume changes from violets to something sharper, like wood smoke and old parchment. The transition is sudden, as if the entity is turning a page in a massive book. It will stop exactly 3 feet in front of you. In this moment, you must remain perfectly motionless. Do not blink too often. Do not let your heart beat with such violence that it shakes your shoulders. The entity is a collector of proximity. It does not want to eat your flesh or haunt your dreams. It wants to press you into its own existence. You will feel the temperature drop as the pressed petals begin to vibrate, shedding rapidly until they form a halo around your head. It is a frantic, shivering motion, like a forest of trees losing their leaves in a sudden gust of wind. One by one, the flowers will detach from its body and drift toward you, settling on your shoulders like a heavy cloak of autumn debris. You can feel them landing the sharp edge of a dried rose petal, the soft fluff of baby's breath. It is trying to memorize your shape. If you move too quickly, it will lose your likeness and begin to scatter, leaving you with a face that is slightly blurred in your memory for days. You must be patient. To finish the task, reach out and touch its central core, a dense cluster of deep crimson petals. As your skin meets the dry texture, the perfume will peak, filling your lungs until you can taste the color of the flowers. It is a rich, earthy flavor that lingers on the back of your tongue like a secret. Then, the entity will fold inward, collapsing into a singular mound of botanical debris. The scent will fade to a faint hint of dust, and the hall will return to its hollow silence. You may leave then, but as you walk back toward the heavy steel doors, remember that the perfume never truly leaves the room. It simply waits for the next person to provide a new shape for its petals to hold. The worst part is not when the figure stands before you, but the realization that as soon as you leave, it begins to shed a single petal every hour until it finds someone else to press into its memory. The weather of the interior. I suppose you want to know if I was alone on that buoy tender, but the answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. When we anchored in that stretch of the channel, the sea was a flat, oily sheet of charcoal, and the blinking light of the marker rhythmically sliced through the fog like a heartbeat. It was supposed to be a standard 3-day haul, just me, the steady groan of the hull against the swells, and the occasional cry of a lonely gull. But something changed on the second night when I realized that the small porthole in my cabin wasn't showing me the world outside anymore. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps some lingering condensation from the morning mist. I looked out at the horizon, expecting to see the rain-slicked waves and the towering masts of the distant buoy, but what I saw instead was a violent, golden thunderstorm. Inside that tiny circle of glass, lightning cracked across a violet sky, and heavy raindrops hammered against the pane with an audible thrum. Yet, when I turned my head to look at the rest of the room, it remained bone-dry and silent. The air in the cabin didn't smell of salt. It smelled of ozone and scorched earth, as if the storm were leaking out of the glass and into my lungs. It was unsettling enough, but the true terror began when I realized that the weather inside the window changed depending on where I stood. If I sat by the stove, the porthole showed a blizzard of white powder. If I moved toward the bed, it became a scorching desert with shimmering heat waves dancing over dunes of orange sand. It felt as though the window was a portal to a different reality entirely, one that existed independently of our physical location in the ocean. Then came the feeling of being watched. On the third night, I lay in my bunk, watching the desert sands swirl inside the glass, when I felt the weight of the sheets shift. It wasn't the wind. The cabin was still and heavy with the scent of old wood. Something had moved into the space where I had just been lying. It didn't have a solid form that I could see clearly, but it had a distinct presence. It was a creature of texture and temperature rather than shape. It felt like wet velvet combined with the warmth of a stone left in the sun. When I finally gathered the courage to sit up, I saw it settle into the hollow of my pillow and the curve of my spine. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a collection of iridescent scales that shimmered like oil on water, each one humming with a faint vibration. It had 3 pairs of heavy, feathered ears that fanned out like a crown, and its body was segmented like a polished tortoiseshell, but soft enough to yield under my touch. As I watched, the entity pulled itself into the indentation of the mattress, stretching its limbs, which were thick and muscular, covered in fine, copper-colored fuzz. It didn't just occupy the space, it claimed it. It radiated a steady, pulsing heat that seeped through the linen, making my skin tingle as if I were lying next to a living furnace. Every time I tried to move, the entity adjusted its weight, molding itself perfectly into the curve of my shoulder. It felt like a heavy, warm secret. On the final morning, the storm inside the window finally died down, leaving behind a vast, still meadow of tall grass under a pale moon. The entity was gone from the sheets, but it left behind a faint dusting of copper-colored fuzz and a lingering scent of crushed mint. I climbed out of bed, my muscles aching with that strange warmth, and looked at the window one last time. The desert had vanished, replaced by a deep, underwater forest where glowing anemones swayed in a current of liquid light. I realized then that the entity wasn't just visiting my cabin, it was traveling between those worlds, and it had chosen me as its temporary anchor. When I finally stepped onto the deck to begin our journey home, I felt a strange lightness in my chest, as if a part of me were still resting in that warm hollow. But when I looked back at the porthole, the weather inside had shifted again, showing a towering mountain range capped with snow. As we sailed away, the little window remained steady, and for one heartbeat, I saw a single copper-colored feather drift down from the top of the glass to land on my thumb, still radiating the heat of a sun that didn't exist in our sky. The toll of the Shimmer. 911. Just started my shift at Bridge Gate 4. It is 2 a.m. The city lights are far below, but up here, it is just me and the endless stretch of asphalt. I can type because the wind hums too loudly for speech. My fingers feel heavy on the keys. 911. There is a strange haze in the air tonight. It isn't fog. It feels thick, like breathing through wet velvet. The cars are few and far between, but every time one passes, I see it. A ripple in the atmosphere near the center of the span. 911. I think I know what it is now. It is a heat shimmer. Not the kind from a hot road, but something solid yet fluid. It stays perfectly still, held like a sharp breath before an exhale. It has no distinct shape until it moves. When it does move, it doesn't glide, it pulses. 911. A car just passed. A vintage sedan. The driver didn't see the shimmer, but I did. It was hovering 3 feet above the lane. It looks like a piece of warped glass suspended in midair, shimmering with colors that don't quite have names. Amber, bruised purple, and a metallic copper. 911. Something is wrong with my hands. The shimmer just moved from the center of the bridge toward my booth. It didn't walk, it simply occupied new space. It is closer now. I can see its texture. It looks like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop, but frozen in time. 911. There is something inside the shimmer. A small, rectangular object. It looks like an old home videotape floating in the center of the heat wave. It's glowing faintly. I can see a tiny screen flickering on its surface. 911. The shimmer reached my booth. It didn't make a sound. It just leaned against the glass of my window. I can see the image on the small screen now. It is a video of a person sitting in a chair, filmed from behind. They are wearing my favorite wool sweater. They have my messy hair. 911. Wait. The person in the video turned around. It is my face. But it isn't me. My jaw is slightly wider than usual. My teeth are perfectly straight and white, like a row of pearls. When I look at the screen, I see myself blinking, but the me on the screen has a slight delay, as if the image is catching up to reality. 911. The shimmer is moving faster now. It is no longer hovering, it is reaching out. A ripple of amber light extended toward me like a slow-motion wave. It didn't touch my face first. It reached for my right hand. 911. It closed around my wrist. It felt heavy. Not like a hand, but like being submerged in warm syrup. The shimmer held me tight. It wasn't cold or hot, it was just present. As it squeezed, the video on its surface changed to a close-up of my eyes. 911. I can feel the shimmer pulling. It is dragging my arm toward the center of the bridge. The booth feels smaller now. The lights are dimming. The face in the video is smiling. It's a wide, toothy grin that feels like it belongs to someone who has been waiting for me for a very long time. 911. My skin where the shimmer touches is starting to change. It isn't turning into heat or ice. It is becoming smooth and slightly translucent. I can see my bones beneath the surface, glowing with that same bruised purple light. 911. The person in the video raised a hand and waved at me. Then, they spoke, though there was no sound. I could feel the vibration in my arm. They whispered my name, but their lips moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. 911. It is pulling me fully into its center now. The booth is disappearing. The road is falling away. I can see the Shimmer's interior clearly. There are dozens of other faces in there, all blinking in different rhythms, all wearing my sweater in different shades of blue and green. 911. It has pulled me in completely. My body feels stretched, like taffy being pulled thin. I am no longer sitting in the chair. I am becoming part of the ripple. The video screen is getting bigger, filling my entire vision until there is nothing left but the image of myself. 911. It's done. The shimmer has settled. The booth is empty now. My body is gone, replaced by a single, perfect pulse of amber light hanging in the middle of the bridge. I am not just watching the video anymore. I am the frame that holds it. 911. A new car is approaching from the north. The shimmer is ready for the next viewer to look inside and see who is waiting. The inhale of the nursery. The Victorian workhouse was a beast of brick and limestone, a sprawling machine designed to turn orphans into laborers. At night, the dormitory became a cavern of heavy shadows and the rhythmic snoring of 40 sleeping children. I lay on my thin pallet, the rough wool blanket scratchy against my neck, listening to the silence that lived between the breaths of others. In the corner of the room stood the nursery, a small, partitioned alcove where we kept the infants who were too young for the main beds. It was supposed to be empty tonight, for the youngest babe had been taken to the infirmary earlier in the day, leaving the crib a hollow wooden shell. Yet, as the grandfather clock struck midnight, a sound began to bleed from that small room. It was a lullaby, thin and melodic, drifting through the heavy air like a ribbon of silk. The melody didn't belong to any human voice I recognized. It was slightly off-key, with notes that seemed to stretch and sag as if the singer were pulling on them. Sleep now, little seed, slash beneath the velvet fold, slash a secret waits for you, slash in stories yet untold. It was a children's bedtime rhyme my mother used to hum, but in this desolate hall, it felt heavy with intent. As the melody repeated, I noticed a strange sensation in my chest, a subtle pressure, as if the air itself were being pulled toward the nursery. Every time the lullaby reached a high note, the dust motes in the dormitory would dance toward the alcove, and the curtains of my bed hung limp, drawn toward the source of the sound by an invisible tide. I sat up, my breath hitching. The nursery was supposed to be vacant, but the floorboards were beginning to groan as if something massive were leaning against them from the inside. Then came the breathing. It wasn't the steady rhythm of a human lung. It was a reverse inhale, a slow, sucking pull that sounded like a deep gasp held for too long. Instead of air flowing out and being exhaled, it felt as though the room was drinking in the atmosphere. I heard a wet, rhythmic thrumming, like a heart beating underwater. Watch how the shadows creep, slash where silence learns to speak. The rhyme continued, its tempo slowing down. My skin prickled. I realized that every time the entity took an inhale, the candles on the nearby tables didn't flicker. They leaned, their flames stretching toward the nursery like tiny orange fingers reaching for a feast. It was pulling the very heat out of the air. A soft, metallic scraping sound followed, the sound of something with texture moving across wood. The entity emerged from the shadows of the crib, but it was not a ghost or a familiar shape. It looked like a cluster of woven willow branches, interconnected by shimmering, iridescent membranes that pulsed with a dull amber light. It had no face in the traditional sense, only a wide, vertical slit running down its center that rippled like a disturbed pond. It didn't have eyes. Instead, it had 3 pairs of velvet-covered sensory pits along its sides that flared open and shut. It moved by expanding its woven body, then snapping inward, drawing the air toward its central slit with a hungry, vacuum-like force. As it drifted into the main dormitory, the temperature plummeted. The children nearby began to stir, their hair being pulled toward the entity as if they were submerged in an invisible pool of water. It glided over my bed, its amber membranes glowing brighter. I felt the air leave my lungs, not because I was exhaling, but because the creature was stealing it from me. It paused above my head, and for a moment, the world went perfectly still. The lullaby reached its final line. Stay still while the world sighs, / for the breather sees your eyes. The creature opened its central slit wide, and I felt a sudden, violent tug on my very soul, as if it were trying to pull my consciousness into its hollow core. Then, with one final, echoing suction of air, the entity collapsed inward, folding like a piece of origami until it was no larger than a walnut. The nursery fell silent, and the candles stood straight again. I lay there in the sudden vacuum, shivering in the cold. When I finally found the courage to look at the floor where it had rested, I saw that it hadn't vanished entirely. It had simply shrunk into a small, hard knot of woven wood. It sat there perfectly still, but as I watched, one of its velvet pits flicked open just enough to reveal a sliver of deep, pulsing violet inside. I realized then that while it was resting, it wasn't sleeping. It was merely waiting for the next time it needed to breathe me in. The pulse in the terminal. The automated voice over the intercom had announced my delay 3 hours ago. Gate 42 is now a sanctuary, it had chirped, before fading into the hum of the ventilation system. Now, the terminal was a cathedral of hollow glass and linoleum, stripped of its crowds. I sat in seat 14B, my suitcase anchored beside me like a loyal dog. The overhead lights were dimmed to a pale amber, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and contract with every breath I took. Outside, the tarmac was a frozen lake of asphalt, reflecting the bruised purple of the midnight sky. To my left, an empty row of seats stood in perfect formation. To my right, a discarded newsstand leaned precariously against a pillar. It was quiet enough that I could hear the internal mechanics of the building, the distant groan of metal cooling, and the rhythmic hiss of air escaping the pipes. I decided to close my eyes for just a moment, leaning my head back against the hard plastic. My sleep-tracking watch hummed softly against my wrist, beginning its nightly tally of my vitals. At first, it was a simple rhythm. Asterisk heartbeat, subject. Breath, subject. Asterisk, I drifted into a shallow slumber, the kind where you are aware of the world but not fully submerged in it. In this half-dream, I felt a shift in the air pressure. It wasn't a gust or a breeze, it was a displacement of volume. Something massive had moved outside the towering glass pane of the terminal wall. Because the window was so vast, I couldn't see the whole thing at once. Instead, I saw a curve of textured surface, something resembling weathered bronze and velvet moss, slide past my line of sight. It was slow, deliberate, moving with the grace of a whale gliding through deep water. Then, the watch on my wrist vibrated twice. Asterisk heartbeat, subject. Heartbeat, entity, asterisk my eyes snapped open. The terminal was still silent, but the air felt heavier, as if the oxygen had been compressed by an invisible weight. I looked out at the glass. The bronze-colored mass was still there, looming just beyond the pane. It wasn't a beast or a ghost. It was a traveler of the outer reaches, so gargantuan that its head was still above the terminal roof while its tail trailed miles behind into the dark horizon. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The watch flickered again. Asterisk heartbeat, subject. Heartbeat, entity, asterisk it was steady. A rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards of the terminal. It felt like a subterranean drum, a deep thump-thump that matched my own pulse, but moved with a slightly different cadence. I realized then that it wasn't just passing by, it was reacting to me. As the entity drifted further along its path, its face, if you could call it that, began to emerge in the window. It didn't have a nose or a mouth. Instead, it possessed a series of iridescent ridges that rippled like a closing fan. Each ridge was covered in tiny, crystalline bumps that caught the amber light of the terminal. It looked like a giant, floating shell, yet it moved with organic fluidity. I watched as one of its massive ridges brushed against the glass. The sound wasn't a crash, it was a low, melodic chime, like a finger tracing the rim of a wine glass. Every time it touched the pane, the watch would pulse. Asterisk heartbeat, subject. Heartbeat, entity, dot asterisk, I felt a strange sense of vertigo. I was so small, a speck of dust in a vast hangar, watching a creature that had likely spent centuries navigating the void between stars. It moved with such profound patience. It didn't rush to get past me. It took its time to feel my presence. Around midnight, the terminal began to vibrate. The entity was now directly overhead. I could see the texture of its skin, deep grooves filled with a glowing, amber fluid that pulsed in time with the second heartbeat. It looked like molten honey frozen in stone. It moved so slowly that it felt as though it were hovering rather than traveling. I reached out and pressed my palm against the cool glass. The entity's ridge was mere inches away on the other side. I could see the individual crystalline bumps, each one glowing with a soft radiance. For a moment, the two heartbeats aligned perfectly. My pulse quickened to match its steady, oceanic thrum. Asterisk heartbeat, subject. Heartbeat, entity, dot asterisk then, as quickly as it had arrived, the massive curve began to move away. The bronze surface smoothed out, the ridges straightened, and the glow began to dim. It was heading toward the far end of the terminal, moving toward the horizon where the sky met the earth. I watched it shrink until it was just a speck of light, then a flicker, and finally, nothing but the empty expanse of the night. I sat in silence for a long time after it vanished, the watch eventually falling still as my own heart rate returned to its resting state. The terminal felt larger now, more cavernous, as if the presence of such a giant had left a vacuum in the air. I stood up and stretched, feeling the lingering vibration in my bones. I checked my watch one last time before gathering my things. The numbers were gone, but the log remained etched on the tiny screen. Asterisk heartbeat, subject. Heartbeat, entity, dot asterisk. I looked back at the window one last time, half expecting to see a lingering shadow or a smudge of bronze dust. But as I turned to walk toward the exit, I noticed something in the reflection of the glass. Even though the entity was miles away now, there was a single, perfectly circular indentation on the pane where it had touched me, and right next to that mark, a tiny, wet trail of amber fluid had trickled down like a single tear. The dial-up twin. If you are reading this, please pack the essentials carefully. I want to leave these instructions for my successor, because by the time you finish reading them, I will be part of the slope. My sister and I were always a match set, two halves of a single soul split into twin bodies. But lately, the division has blurred. On this scree slope above the tree line, where the rocks are jagged enough to catch your breath and the shadows pool like spilled ink, the distinction between me and her has begun to fail. I remember her face clearly, but when I look at my own hands, they feel less like mine and more like a borrowed gift. It started 3 days ago during our ascent into the high country. The air was thinning, turning sharp as flint, and the silence was heavy enough to press against our eardrums. That is when we first heard the sound, a jagged, mechanical trill that tore through the mountain's hush. It wasn't a voice exactly. It was the shriek of a dial-up handshake, a frantic burst of data seeking a path into our world. At first, I thought it was just the wind whistling through the limestone gaps, but then the shape appeared at the edge of the scree. It did not walk, it pulsed forward in rhythmic jolts. It looked like a massive, floating weaver's loom made of copper wire and moth wings. Instead of a face, it had a shimmering dome of translucent membrane that rippled with internal electricity. Its body was a cluster of vibrating filaments, hundreds of them, each tipped with a tiny, glowing bead that hummed at different frequencies. It didn't have limbs so much as extensions, flickering ribbons of light that swept across the rocks like searchlights. It began to negotiate. The entity didn't speak in words, it spoke in connection. Every time it shrieked that high-pitched, stuttering electronic cry, I felt a piece of my identity slip away. It was trying to sync with us, to pull our consciousness into its own humming network. And the terrifying thing is, it chose her first. By the second day, I noticed Alara's movements becoming rhythmic and mechanical. She would stop mid-stride and emit a soft, melodic chirp, her eyes glazing over as if she were processing a massive stream of information. When I reached out to touch her hand, my own fingers felt heavier, more solid, while hers felt like they were turning into something porous and humming. The entity hovered behind us, its copper wires swaying in the mountain breeze, pulsing with an increasingly frantic series of modem shrieks. "Are you sure it's her?" I asked on the third morning, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, as if it were being compressed into a smaller space. Alara didn't answer immediately. She turned toward me, and for a moment, her face was perfectly clear, the curve of her nose, the way she bit her lip. Then, in a blink, her features shifted. Her skin smoothed out until it looked like a wet pearl, and her hair began to stand on end, vibrating with tiny sparks. "I am still here," she said, but her voice had lost its human warmth. It was now layered with the crackle of static. That was the moment the vertigo hit me. I looked at her, and for a heartbeat, I couldn't tell which one of us was original. Was I the girl who remembered childhood, or was she the memory? Or had we both been swapped? The entity let out a long, sustained whine, a low-frequency drone that made the scree stones dance. It was ready to finalize the connection. It wanted to bridge the gap between our meat and its wires. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the rocks in shades of bruised purple, the negotiation reached its peak. The shape expanded, its filaments stretching out until they touched both of us. I felt a sudden, violent tug at my chest, like a hook pulling a thread from a tapestry. My memories began to flicker. I remembered our mother's garden, but I also saw a vast, humming web of golden data points. I remembered the taste of apples, and simultaneously, I tasted the sensation of 1,000 signals crossing at once. Alara reached out for my hand. Her fingers were no longer skin. They were thin ribbons of copper light. "Who is holding whom?" she whispered, her voice now almost entirely electronic. I looked down at our joined hands and realized the horror. My hand was becoming translucent, while hers was gaining weight and color. The entity gave one final, piercing shriek, a perfect, clean handshake that echoed off the surrounding peaks. In that instant, the transition completed. The shape folded inward on itself, collapsing into a single, glowing point of light before vanishing into the darkness. I stood alone on the slope now, the silence returning with a heavy thud. I looked at my hands and saw they were solid, warm, and perfectly human. But when I looked across the rocks at Alara, she was gone. There was only a pile of discarded copper wires and moth wings where she had stood. I sat down on the stone and felt a strange sense of relief, until I realized that while my body was real, her memories were now mine and mine were hers. I closed my eyes and saw her favorite blue ribbon in my mind, but when I tried to remember the color of my own favorite sweater, there was only the hum of a modem. I am sitting here on the scree, the cold mountain air biting at my skin, perfectly intact and entirely alone. I can still feel her presence inside my head, a ghost in the machine of my brain. But as I reach out to touch the ground, I realize that though I am physically here, I am only holding onto her leftovers. I reached out to grab a stone, but instead of feeling the cold rock, my fingers felt the faint, lingering vibration of a signal that had already been received. The Condensation Guest. The motel was a sagging structure of faded beige, smelling faintly of ozone and old upholstery. I had checked into room 14, but the real magic, or perhaps the haunting, lay in the alcove at the very end of the western wing. It was a narrow nook where the hum of the industrial ice machine provided a constant, rhythmic vibration against my molars. In the center of that alcove stood a tall, rectangular mirror framed in tarnished brass. The glass wasn't perfectly clear. It bore a permanent veil of condensation from the machine's breath, making it look like a sheet of frozen water. On the first night, I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the moisture drip. It was steady until about midnight. That is when I noticed the distortion. In the center of the fog, where the ice machine's breath had pulled most heavily, a face began to emerge. It wasn't a solid shape at first, just a smudge of clarity against the blur. As I watched, it defined itself into something distinct, a face with high, arched cheekbones and a mouth that curved into a wide, pleasant grin. The strange thing was its timing. When I blinked, my own reflection would settle, but the face in the glass arrived just a fraction of a second before mine did. It was as if it were anticipating my existence. Every time I looked at it, the mirror face reached out with features made of liquid droplets. Its skin wasn't smooth. It looked like hammered copper dipped in wax, and its eyes were two large, amber beads that caught the dim light like honey trapped in resin. It didn't have many teeth, just a row of soft, rounded nubs, but it smiled wider every time I moved. I stood up to investigate, my own face appearing in the glass, trying to keep pace with its exuberant expression. "Are you waiting for me?" I whispered. The reflection responded by widening its grin until the corners of the mouth nearly touched its ears. It felt like a polite guest, a silent companion that lived inside the humidity. Then came the second night, and the atmosphere shifted from cozy to claustrophobic. I didn't know if it was the same day or the next, for the time seemed to fold inward like an accordion. The alcove felt smaller, the air thicker with a moisture that tasted of salt and cold iron. I walked toward the mirror again, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. This time, the face wasn't just waiting, it was moving independently of my own features. When I looked stoic, its grin remained wide. When I frowned, it laughed without making a sound. The condensation began to behave strangely, migrating from the bottom of the frame toward the center as if being pulled by gravity or intent. I reached out a hand to touch the glass. My fingertip met the surface, and for a moment, there was no resistance. The face didn't just reflect my touch, it leaned into it. It felt like pressing against a cold, wet membrane. The amber beads of its eyes seemed to pulse. I saw its cheeks ripple as if something underneath the wax-like skin were trying to push outward. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the boundary between my face and the mirror's face began to fray. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, trying to outrun the anticipation of the reflection. I stared until my eyes ached. My own expression was one of mild curiosity, but the reflection's grin was becoming something more complex, a stretch of joy so profound it looked almost painful. It started to finger its way into reality. Small beads of water began to spill off the glass, not falling down, but rolling toward my chest as if being pushed by a phantom hand. The face in the mirror grew larger, the high cheekbones sharpening until they looked like polished stones. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was an entity using the condensation as its clay, molding itself into existence from the dampness of the air. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. I realized then that the timing hadn't been a coincidence of physics, it was a countdown. The face wasn't arriving half a second before mine because it was reacting to me, it was preparing for me. In the final moments of the night, as the ice machine gave one last, shuddering hum and fell silent, the condensation vanished almost instantly. The mirror became perfectly clear. I stood there, my own face neutral and tired. Then, the face flickered into being with a violent smoothness. It didn't wait for me to move this time. It surged forward, its waxen skin stretching until it occupied every inch of the glass. Its amber eyes flared with an inner light, and its mouth opened in a silent, joyous O. The smile was so wide that the edges pulled back to reveal a shimmering landscape of water droplets inside the mouth. I reached out, my heart hammering against my ribs, and pressed my palm flat against the center of the glass. The surface didn't feel like cold glass anymore. It felt like a heartbeat. The face leaned forward so far that its high cheekbones brushed against mine, and for one lingering second, our skin merged in a bridge of moisture. I saw my own pupils reflect in its amber beads, but they weren't just my eyes. They were the eyes of something watching me from the other side of the fog. Then the face vanished. The mirror returned to its blank, clear state. I stood alone in the silence of the alcove, the smell of salt hanging heavy in the air. I stepped back, ready to return to my room, but I stopped when I felt a faint dampness on my own cheek. I reached up and touched it, finding a single drop of water that had fallen from the glass. When I looked back at the mirror one last time before turning away, there was no face waiting for me, yet I could still feel its gaze lingering on the back of my neck. The Bloom of the Unseen Tenant. The app on my phone blinked with a steady, pulsing amber light. Drop off. The Inheritance Farmhouse. It was a sprawling, lonely structure tucked into a fold of valley that felt as though it hadn't been visited by a human in decades. The notes from the customer were brief, but oddly specific. Leave at the porch. Do not touch the door handle until you hear the hum. I pulled my van over, the engine clicking as it cooled in the heavy silence. The farmhouse stood like a skeletal giant, its wood weathered to a silver-gray hue, surrounded by fields of tall, dormant grass that didn't sway because there was no wind. As I stepped out, the air tasted of crushed herbs and old dust. It felt less like a house and more like an invitation, or perhaps a warning. I walked toward the porch, my boots making soft thuds against the dirt. The closer I got, the more the silence began to vibrate with a low, steady frequency, a hum that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the earth. It was a melodic vibration, felt in the marrow of my teeth rather than heard by my ears. I reached out toward the heavy oak door, but before my fingers could graze the iron handle, the hum spiked into a sharp, resonant note. Then, something fell from the rafters above the porch. It wasn't a bird or a piece of debris. It was a flurry of pressed petals, deep indigo and dusty ochre, falling in a perfect arc. They hit the floorboards with a dry, rhythmic click-clack, settling into the shape of a heavy footprint. I froze. There were no other prints around it, only this one, as if something had stood there for a second and then simply vanished into the rafters. I exhaled, my breath hitching in my chest. "Hello," I whispered to the empty porch. The hum responded by deepening an octave. From inside the house came a soft, shuffling sound, followed by another burst of petals. They drifted out from the crack under the door like spilled confetti, each one carrying the faint scent of dried lavender and old parchment. My curiosity outweighed my trepidation. I pushed the door open just an inch. The interior was bathed in a dim, amber glow that didn't seem to come from any visible lamp. In the center of the foyer stood a figure. It wasn't flesh or bone. It was a towering silhouette composed entirely of pressed flowers. Petals of rose, lily, and thistle were fused together into a dense, layered body. Its head was a burst of white jasmine, and its torso was a thick mantle of deep crimson peonies. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but rather a cluster of golden stamens that served as eyes, glowing with a faint, internal light. The figure was perfectly still, yet it radiated a sense of heavy presence. As I stepped inside, the humming grew louder, vibrating against my ribs. "Are you the tenant?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. The flower figure didn't move its mouth, but a new shower of petals erupted from its shoulders, cascading down like a waterfall to form another footprint at my feet. It was as if it were walking without moving its limbs, marking its progress by shedding pieces of itself onto the floor. I took a step forward, and the figure responded by leaning slightly toward me, its jasmine head swaying. The scent became overwhelming, sweet, earthy, and slightly sharp. Then, the strangest thing happened. I reached out to touch one of the large peonies on its chest, but as my finger made contact, the petal didn't just feel dry, it felt hungry. It pulsed against my skin like a tiny heart. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The figure began to move with a fluid, swirling motion, its body spinning slowly until it was a blur of color. As it turned, dozens of petals flew off its frame, sticking to my clothes, my hair, and my skin like tiny, velvet magnets. I felt a strange tugging sensation on my fingertips. I looked down at my right hand. Where my thumb had touched the peony, the skin was beginning to change. It wasn't turning into a flower yet, but it was. Becoming textured, ridged with tiny veins that looked like the underside of a leaf. My fingerprints were starting to stretch and deepen, losing their smooth curves and becoming the serrated edges of a rose petal. I pulled my hand back in shock. The figure took one final step forward, its jasmine head coming level with my own face. It didn't make a sound, but it shed a final, massive cluster of petals from its crown. They landed on my forehead, and for a moment, the world was nothing but the scent of summer in a jar. I realized then that the figure wasn't just inhabiting the house, it was slowly converting everything into itself. The hum returned, but this time it was coming from inside my own chest. My hand was no longer entirely skin. The texture had spread to my wrist, and by the time I looked back at the door, my grip on the handle felt different, more deliberate, more rooted. I realized that when I left this house, I wouldn't just be a driver who delivered a package. I would be part of the collection. I stood there for a long minute, watching the flower figure pulse with light. Finally, I turned to leave, my movement slightly stiffer than before. As I stepped back onto the porch and looked down at my hand one last time, I saw that my skin had completely transitioned into a soft, velvety bloom, and as I moved my fingers, they left behind tiny trails of pollen in the air. The house sat silent again, but as I walked back to my van, I noticed something small and persistent. Every time I took a step, a single petal fell from my shoulder, landing on the dirt with a soft thud, marking the path of a thing that was no longer entirely human. The Count of the Collapsing Rim. Step this way, travelers. Keep your lanterns steady and your breathing shallow. You are standing in the remains of Sector 4, a mining camp that was abandoned exactly 48 hours ago. The men who worked here didn't just leave because the ore ran out. They left because of what they found at the edge of the map. Look toward the horizon. In our world, we assume the land stretches forever of a rolling wave of dirt and stone. But here, the miners realized a terrifying truth. The horizon is not an infinite distance. It is a physical wall, a literal cliff face of existence that curves inward. Every day, as the earth moves, the wall creeps closer. You can feel it now, that slight tug in your chest. It is the weight of something approaching from the far reaches. The crew lived in fear of the shrinking. They knew that one day, the ground beneath their boots would simply end, and they would tumble into the great beyond. To measure this closing gap, they relied on the vessel. Most people expect a ghost to be a shimmering vapor or a weeping face, but the inhabitant of this camp is far more peculiar. It is a towering structure of stacked glass pill bottles, roughly 7 feet tall. Each bottle is different. Some are amber, some are frosted white, and some are deep cobalt blue. They aren't held together by string or glue. They hover in a vertical stack, humming with a low, rhythmic vibration. On the first night of their departure, I heard it for the first time. It was a clatter from the center of the mess tent. "Who goes there?" one of the miners shouted into the dark. The vessel responded by shifting its weight. A dozen bottles at its base rattled against each other like marbles in a jar. Then came the sound, a hollow, melodic chime as it struck its own side to announce its count. 100, it chimed. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It was the resonance of glass meeting glass, vibrating through the air. On the second night, the camp felt heavier. The air tasted of dust and old medicine. I walked toward the mess tent, my boots crunching on the gravel. The vessel was standing in the center, its bottles swaying even though there was no wind. It struck its side again, a sharper, more urgent ring this time. 99, it announced. By the third night, the atmosphere shifted from eerie to oppressive. The miners had already slept off to the village, but I stayed behind to see the count. The vessel was no longer just rattling, it was spinning slowly on its base. Each bottle seemed to have a different personality. Some were wide-mouthed and clunky, others slender and delicate. They produced a cascading melody as they collided. 98, it whispered. But something was wrong. The count was falling faster than expected. On the fourth night, I noticed that the horizon seemed to have moved visibly closer. The distant mountains looked sharper, looming over us like a closing door. The vessel didn't just sit. It began to migrate toward me, its glass body clicking against the floorboards. It moved with a jerky, staccato gait, like a clockwork toy with a slight hitch in its gears. 96, it declared. It skipped a number. The miners had whispered that when the vessel skips, something has been consumed by the wall. On the fifth night, I sat on a crate and watched it closely. It was no longer just counting. It was reacting to my presence. As I watched, one of its amber bottles popped off the top and shattered on the floor. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the remaining stack shuddered. 94, it groaned. The wall was coming. I could see the edge of the world beginning to curl inward at the periphery of my vision. The grass near the boundary started to turn silver, then translucent, as if the reality holding it together was thinning out. The vessel began to move faster now, its rattling becoming a frantic, desperate clatter. It wasn't just counting down to 0, it was counting down to the moment of impact. On the 6th night, I felt a sudden draft, a cold breeze that didn't come from the mountains, but from the very edge of the horizon itself. The vessel stood perfectly still in the center of the camp. It seemed to be leaning forward, its tallest bottle pointing toward me like a needle on a compass. 90, it announced with a clear, crystalline ring. It was losing height. Every time it counted, one bottle would vanish into thin air, as if sucked into the shrinking space of the camp. By the 8th night, the vessel was only 4 feet tall. The horizon was so close now that I could see the texture of the wall, a shimmering, iridescent surface like a frozen lake made of oil. 82, it chimed. On the 9th night, the silence was heavy. The vessel was a mere stump of glass, only 3 bottles high. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble as the wall reached the edge of the camp. I could see the dirt beginning to fold upward, like a carpet being pushed by an invisible hand. 75, it spoke, its voice now a muffled thrum. Then came the final night. The mining camp was nearly gone. The wall had reached the very center of the mess tent. I stood alone, my breath hitching in the cooling air. The vessel was nothing more than a single, large cobalt bottle sitting on the dirt. It didn't rattle anymore. It simply vibrated with a deep, resonant hum that shook my teeth. I waited for the final count. I expected it to say 1. I expected it to give me a moment of peace before the end. The wall was inches from my toes now, the reality of the camp stretching thin like pulled taffy. The bottle tipped over and struck the ground with a final, echoing thud. 0, it whispered. As the word left its mouth, the wall hit me, not as a crash, but as a sudden, silent folding of everything I knew into a single point of infinite depth. The translator's transcription of the Static Watcher. I am writing these notes for the scholars who will eventually attempt to decode the transcript. Please accept my apologies for the final passage. It refuses to be translated into a human tongue, remaining as an abrasive hum that vibrates against the teeth. The following is the account provided by Elias, the night shift attendant at the Central Crisis Hotline during the Great Eclipse blackout of 1924. The city had fallen into a heavy, velvet silence. Without the hum of electricity or the roar of traffic, the air felt thick, as if it were holding its breath. I sat behind my mahogany desk, my ears ringing with the absence of sound. In front of me lay the copper-bound baby monitor, a strange piece of technology we used to gauge the vibe of the empty nursery in the hall. It was a simple device, a small brass disc that captured the faintest vibrations and projected them into the room. At first, there was only the sound of my own breathing. Then, the monitor chirped. It wasn't an external noise, it was a response to my internal thought. I hadn't spoken, but the brass disc emitted a soft, rhythmic pulsing. Is someone there? I whispered into the receiver. The monitor didn't just echo me. It replied in a voice that sounded like grinding stones smoothed by water. We are waiting for the blink. A chill crawled up my spine. The blackout had made the whole way outside my desk a void of absolute ink. Every time I blinked, the darkness felt heavier, as if it were pressing against my eyelids like a physical weight. I realized then that the monitor wasn't just capturing sound, it was reacting to my awareness. I took a deep breath and spoke again into the brass disc. Who is waiting? The response came instantly, vibrating through the wood of the desk. The one who catches the flash. That was when I saw it. A sudden, violent spark jumped from the monitor, a tiny, internal combustion of light. For a fraction of a second, the room was illuminated with a sharp, white flare. In that heartbeat of clarity, I saw it. A figure burned into my vision by the flash. It stood just behind my chair. It did not have a human face in the traditional sense. Its head was a smooth, porcelain white sphere with a series of symmetrical ridges running across the top like a thumbprint on a planet. Instead of eyes, it had 3 glowing slits arranged in a triangle around its center, and for a mouth, a single horizontal seam that pulsed with a faint amber light. It didn't have limbs so much as ribbons of velvet-textured skin that trailed behind it like the tail of a comet. I froze. The flash was over and the room returned to shadow, but the image of the creature remained scorched into my retinas. "Do not close your eyes," the monitor whispered, though there were no lips to move. "If you close them, we move closer." The fear became a physical pressure in my chest. I tried to keep my eyes wide, staring at the spot where the creature had been burned into my sight. But fatigue is a traitorous thing. My eyelids grew heavy, sagging under the weight of the silence. Just one blink, I told myself. It can't catch me if I don't see it. I closed my eyes for less than a second. The moment my lids met, I felt a sensation of profound displacement. The air grew colder. A faint smell of ozone and crushed violets filled my nostrils. When I snapped my eyes open again, the figure was no longer behind me. It was closer, halfway between us. Its ridges were now visible in the gloom, and its 3 slits glowed with a hungry, steady radiance. Again, the monitor hummed. I blinked again. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The creature was now inches from my face. I could see the velvet texture of its ribbon limbs swaying in a wind that wasn't there. The amber seam of its mouth was twitching, ready to peel open. I realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't just moving, it was adjusting itself to the space I provided by closing my eyes. I tried to hold my gaze on its porcelain head, desperate to keep it from encroaching further. But the blackout seemed to be deepening, the shadows becoming more tactile, reaching out like liquid fingers toward my shoulders. The monitor began to pulse faster, a frantic heartbeat of brass and light. "Speak," the creature commanded, its voice now echoing inside my skull rather than through the air. "I am afraid," I confessed. The figure leaned forward. Its amber seam split open, revealing not teeth or a tongue, but a shimmering pool of liquid gold that rippled like a disturbed pond. It didn't speak with words, it spoke with a feeling, a sense of immense, ancient patience combined with a sudden, sharp hunger. I realized then why the monitor responded to me. It wasn't listening to my voice, it was waiting for me to give it permission to enter my world. Every time I blinked, I offered it a door. I took one final, deep breath and squeezed my eyes shut as hard as I could, trying to hold the darkness steady. I wanted to stay in that state forever, to avoid the movement, to deny it its victory. But eventually, the muscles of my face betrayed me. My eyelids flickered. I opened them one last time. The figure was no longer a few inches away. It was occupying the space where my own face should be, its porcelain head pressing against mine, its 3 slits vibrating with a hum that felt like a secret being shared between 2 souls. The amber pool of its mouth overflowed slightly, a single drop of liquid gold landing on my cheek. It wasn't waiting anymore, it had arrived. I sat perfectly still in the dark, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel the creature's velvet ribbons wrapping around my neck like a heavy, warm scarf. It was no longer just an image burned into my sight, it was a guest in my skin. I looked up, but since there was nothing left to see, I simply felt its presence pressing against my thoughts. I realized then that the monitor had been correct. The creature was always there, lurking in the space between my blinks, waiting for me to finally stop watching it and let it take over. The drift of the departed. The fluorescent lights of the bus depot hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to vibrate against my teeth. It was 4 a.m., that hollow hour where the world feels suspended between what was and what will be. I sat on a vinyl bench that smelled faintly of industrial wax, clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee. The room was nearly empty, save for an elderly man sleeping in a corner and a sprawling family photograph tacked to the far wall. It was a large, heavy-framed portrait of my grandfather's clan, 12 people posed in a rigid line against a backdrop of rolling hills. They were frozen in time, their expressions caught in shades of stoic pride and soft smiles. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the group chat we had started with my circle of friends before they passed away, a strange, digital memorial we kept active even though there was no one left to type a reply. The thread was titled The Quiet Room. It was supposed to be a graveyard of memories, but lately, it had felt more like a conversation. My thumb hovered over the screen as I saw a notification pop up from Marcus, who had died 3 years ago in a hiking accident. "Is it cold where you are?" his last message read. It had appeared out of nowhere, not triggered by my input. Then came Sarah's reply, "Only if you stop moving." I chuckled softly, the sound echoing off the tiled floor. I looked back at the family photograph on the wall. That was when I noticed something peculiar about the center of the image. In the middle of the group stood my great Aunt Martha. However, where her torso should have been, there was a jagged, irregular hole in the paper. It wasn't a tear caused by age. It looked like something had bitten through the reality of the photo. I stood up and walked toward it. As I got closer, the air around the frame seemed to shimmer with heat. I reached out, expecting the dry texture of old parchment, but my fingers sank into the hole. It was warm, uncomfortably so. It felt like pressing my hand against a loaf of bread straight from the oven, yet the surface was smooth and slightly tacky. As I touched it, the hole pulsed. It wasn't just a void, it was expanding by fractions of an inch every time I blinked. A sharp ping echoed through the depot. My phone vibrated in my palm. Another message from Marcus. "The circle is getting bigger." I looked at the photo again. The hole had widened significantly, now consuming great Aunt Martha's shoulders and a bit of her head. It looked less like a gap and more like a pupil. As I watched, a tiny, golden spark flickered deep inside the warmth, swirling like dust in a sunbeam. I decided to open our location-sharing map, a secondary app we had used back when we were all alive. We had kept it active as a joke, but now it served as a ghostly tracker. I looked at Marcus's dot on the screen. He should have been stationary, a permanent marker of his final resting place in the valley. Instead, his blue icon was drifting. It wasn't moving toward a destination. It was wandering aimlessly across the digital terrain, weaving through the mountains like a lost sheep. "Marcus, stay still," I whispered to the empty room. The hole in the photo suddenly surged outward, a wet, peeling sound filling the silence of the depot. It swallowed the hill in the background and began to eat the faces of my cousins on the left. The warmth intensified, radiating off the wall until it felt like standing near a hearth. Then, the group chat exploded with activity. "I can see the walls," Sarah typed. "They are leaning in," Marcus replied. The dots on my map began to move in unison. Every single one of them, Sarah, Marcus, Leo, and the others, began to drift toward a single point in the center of the screen. They weren't just moving, they were accelerating. The distance between them was shrinking as they converged on a coordinate that didn't correspond to any real city or landmark. I felt a sudden draft, even though the depot windows were shut. I turned back to the wall and gasped. The hole in the photograph had grown so large it now dominated the entire frame. It was no longer just a gap. It was a shimmering pool of amber heat that seemed to have depth. I could see things floating inside it, tiny, flickering shapes that looked like memories caught in honey. The elderly man in the corner woke up and sat bolt upright. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wall with an expression of profound recognition. "It's hungry," he croaked, his voice dry as paper. I watched as one of my friend's dots on the map finally reached the center point and stopped perfectly still. At that exact moment, the hole in the photo let out a soft, sighing sound, a literal exhale of hot air that smelled of old books and rain. The edges of the hole began to curl inward like burning paper, moving toward the frame's border. Then, the map flickered. All the dots vanished simultaneously. The screen went black for 3 seconds before a final message appeared in the group chat from Marcus. "We are home." The warmth from the wall surged forward, a wave of heat that washed over my face like a physical touch. The hole had widened to the point where it began to spill out of the frame, dripping onto the floor like molten wax. It didn't fall. It hovered, a shimmering puddle of gold and amber light. I stood frozen as the sound of a soft footstep echoed from inside the wall. Not a sound of something walking on the wall, but something stepping out of the hole. I realized then that the dot on my map hadn't just reached the center, it had fallen into the warmth. The depot fell silent again, the hum of the lights returning to their steady rhythm. The hole was still there, pulsing gently, radiating a heat that made the air shimmer. It felt like a doorway that had finally been unlocked. I took a deep breath and looked at the floor where the gold light pooled. The warmth reached out and touched my toes, and I realized with a jolt of terror that the hole wasn't just showing me where they were, it was waiting for me to step in. The Eulogy of the Velvet Crater. I was tasked with being the lone janitor for the Grand Horizon Convention Center during its off-season. It is a cavernous labyrinth of steel and glass, but my world was the subterranean service corridor, a long, humming artery of concrete that stretched beneath the main halls. The air there always smelled of floor wax and old electricity. In the center of this tunnel sat an anomaly, a solitary, oversized velvet couch with deep crimson fabric. It wasn't meant to be there. It felt like a throne left behind by a forgotten king. Every night, after the heavy doors were bolted and the hum of the ventilation died down, I would sit on that couch to rest my aching feet. The first night, as I sat down, the velvet gave way perfectly under my weight. The next morning, I found it had refilled. The dent was gone. The fabric was smooth, as if no one had ever touched it. That became our ritual. Every evening, I would sink into the crater of my own making, and every morning, the couch would reclaim its perfection. I began to notice small things about the couch's behavior. It didn't just refill. It seemed to anticipate me. On the third night, as I sat down, a faint sound emerged from the velvet, a soft, wet thrumming. Then, something arrived. It wasn't a creature in the traditional sense. It was a miniature atmosphere, a hovering sphere of weather roughly the size of a grapefruit that drifted just above the cushion. It didn't have a face or limbs. Instead, it looked like a swirling marble of iridescent pearlescence, shifting between colors of bruised plum and seafoam green. But its most peculiar trait was the rain. It didn't rain on the floor, nor did it rain on my shoulders. It rained exclusively over one specific point in space, a perfect cylinder of water that fell from the ceiling of the corridor down to a single spot on the couch. The entity would hover there, and the rain would fall with a rhythmic pitter-patter, though the ground remained perfectly dry. As the week progressed, I realized the weather sphere was reacting to my presence. It would drift toward me, but it always maintained its private column of rain. One night, while I sat in silence, the entity hovered directly above my head. For 3 minutes, a localized drizzle soaked my hair and face, while the rest of the corridor remained bone-dry. It felt like being underwater without the weight of the ocean. The water was warm, smelling faintly of crushed mint. But then, the couch began to speak. It didn't have a mouth, but its voice resonated in my chest like a hummed note from a cello. It began to deliver a eulogy for someone who hadn't quite died yet, or perhaps someone who had died so many times they were still lingering. He was a man of sturdy bones. The couch vibrated, the velvet ripples moving like waves. He fell in the garden because his heart simply forgot to beat. The weather sphere pulsed with a golden light as it spoke. The next night, I sat down and the couch hummed again. He was a man of sturdy bones. The couch corrected itself, the velvet tightening. He fell in the garden because his heart forgot to beat, then shattered like glass. By the 5th night, the corrections were becoming more frequent and frantic. The entity began to move faster, its color shifting from plum to a sharp, angry ochre. It would rain harder, the droplets splashing against my forehead with increasing intensity. He was a man of sturdy bones. The couch groaned. He fell in the garden because his heart forgot to beat, then shattered like glass, and finally turned into dust. I found myself watching the weather sphere. It wasn't just hovering, it was mourning. Every time the couch corrected a word, the rain would turn from warm mint to something colder, sharper. The sphere grew larger, expanding until it nearly touched the ceiling, casting a shimmering shadow over me. On the 7th night, the correction became constant. I barely had time to breathe before the couch began its revision. He was a man of sturdy bones, the couch whispered. He fell in the garden because his heart forgot to beat, then shattered like glass, and finally turned into dust, which blew away in a wind that never stopped. The rain became a downpour, a heavy curtain of water that felt as though it were pressing against my skin. I stayed perfectly still, watching the iridescent sphere spin. The couch was no longer just refilling its dent. It was vibrating with the effort of finding the perfect ending. It wanted the eulogy to be absolute. On the 8th night, the corridor felt different. The silence was heavier, and the air felt thick with humidity from the localized rain. I sat down, and the couch didn't just refill its dent, it surged. He was a man of sturdy bones, the couch declared, its voice now a booming resonance that shook the dust from the ceiling. He fell in the garden because his heart forgot to beat, then shattered like glass, and finally turned into dust, which blew away in a wind that never stopped, until it became a memory that refused to fade. The couch went silent. The weather sphere flared with a brilliant, blinding white light, its rain turning into a fine mist that hung in the air like a veil. The velvet was perfectly smooth once more. I sat there for a long time, my hair dripping, my face wet with the garden's history. I stood up to leave, but as I turned to walk toward the exit of the corridor, I felt a strange tug from the cushion behind me. It wasn't just a flat surface anymore. It had held the shape of my weight for 1 second longer than usual before snapping back into its perfect, dentless state. I reached the heavy doors and paused before pulling them open. From the darkness of the corridor, I heard a faint, new hum. The couch was starting a new sentence, but this time, there was no he to describe. It was waiting for a new body to fall in the garden. When I returned the next morning, the rain was gone, and the weather sphere had vanished into the shadows of the ceiling. The couch sat perfectly smooth, its velvet pristine and unblemished. However, when I looked closely at the center of the cushion, there was a tiny, permanent wet spot that never dried, shaped exactly like a human teardrop. The frequency of the fray. I remember the hum of the tires on the asphalt most clearly. It was 2:14 a.m., and the midnight interstate felt like a ribbon of velvet stretched between two voids. I was driving a rusted sedan that smelled of old coffee and damp upholstery when I saw it, a way station, squat and lonely under a halo of buzzing neon. It shouldn't have been there, at least not on this stretch of highway. The sign simply read "Stay," in letters so faded they looked like they were being swallowed by the paint. I pulled over because my engine gave a rhythmic shudder, a metallic cough that suggested it was tired of fighting the wind. I stepped out into the air, which felt heavy and tasted of ozone. The way station wasn't just a building, it was an architectural bruise on the landscape. It had high, slanted roofs and wide windows that looked like cataract filmed eyes. There were no people around, only the distant, lonely moan of a freight truck miles away. As I walked toward the main bay, the silence changed. It wasn't a true silence, it was thick, vibrating with a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache. That is when I felt the first twitch in my left shoulder. It was sharp, like a needle prick. When I reached up to touch it, my hand met skin that was smooth, yet there was a faint, pulsing heat radiating from beneath the surface. I looked down at my arm and gasped. A thin, silver line had appeared across my forearm. It wasn't a scratch or a bruise. It was a scar, perfectly straight and about 3 inches long. The strange thing was that I hadn't been struck by anything. I hadn't tripped over a stone or brushed against a branch. The scar simply existed, as if my skin had decided to remember a blow that never actually landed. It began to itch, a deep, internal itch that felt like something was trying to burrow inward from the surface. Then came the sound. It started as a crackle, the way an old radio behaves when it's searching for a station between two clear signals. It was wet static, the sound of water droplets hitting a hot plate, mixed with the rhythmic beep hum of a long-distance dial tone. The noise didn't come from the air. It seemed to emerge from the walls of the way station itself. I took another step forward, and the scar on my arm pulsed. It widened by an inch, the edges fraying like the hem of a torn sweater. As I watched, the static grew louder, becoming more coherent. It started to take shape in the center of the bay. The entity didn't walk, it coalesced. It was a massive shimmering liquid noise. Imagine a puddle of mercury that had been caught in a thunderstorm. It flickered and bubbled, constantly changing its density. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't entirely liquid either. It looked like a smudge of ink dropped into water, vibrating at a frequency so high it blurred the edges of its body. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a shifting topography of ripples and hums. It moved toward me with a series of wet clicks, each movement accompanied by a different dial tone, a sharp bring, followed by a soft, sighing whir. As it drew closer, the static intensified until it felt like my hair was standing on end. The entity didn't have limbs so much as they were suggestions of motion. Parts of it stretched out into fuzzy ribbons of sound that rippled like waves in a pond. I froze. The scar on my arm began to throb with an intense, rhythmic heat. It wasn't just widening anymore, it was migrating. I watched in silent horror as the silver line began to crawl upward toward my shoulder, moving like a slow-moving worm. Wherever the scar passed, the skin turned a pale, pearlescent white. The entity reached out, or rather, its front edge surged forward and touched my chest. At the moment of contact, the static peaked into a roar of harmony. It was the sound of 1,000 telephones ringing in a distant valley, all muffled by a layer of heavy velvet. I felt a jolt go through my ribs, a sensation of being retuned. My heart skipped a beat, then settled into a steady, slightly off-key rhythm. The scar on my arm didn't stop. It raced toward my collarbone, leaving a trail of white skin in its wake. I realized then that the entity wasn't just visiting me, it was broadcasting through me. It was using my body as a receiver for its own existence. The wait station seemed to dim, the neon lights flickering and dying one by one as if the entity were sucking the energy out of the air. Finally, the movement stopped. The wet static settled into a low, contented hum. The entity didn't vanish. It simply flattened against my chest like a warm, damp cloth, its ripples smoothing out until it was almost still. The scar on my arm had reached my chin, tracing a path from my wrist to just below my jawline. I took a deep breath and felt the vibration settle into my bones. The entity retreated back into the center of the bay, dissolving into a few stray droplets of static that hissed as they hit the concrete floor. I stood there for a long time, listening to the dial tones echo in the rafters. When I finally turned to walk back to my car, the way station felt different, less heavy, more hollow. I climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. My arm was still warm where the scar resided. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the same face that had pulled into the lot an hour ago. Instead, I saw my own eyes looking back at me from a face that felt slightly rearranged. The scar had finished its journey, but as I started the engine and shifted into gear, I realized something about the white line on my skin. It wasn't just a mark of where the entity had touched me. I reached up to touch the new scar near my jaw and felt it twitch beneath my thumb, independent of my own will. The hum in my ears hadn't stopped when I left the station. It was still there, a constant, tiny beep hum that lived inside my skull. As I drove away into the dark, I realized the entity hadn't just moved through me, it had left its signature behind, and now every time I blinked, I could hear the faint, wet sound of static dripping from the back of my throat. It was a constant, rhythmic pulse, matching the hum of the tires on the asphalt. The cartographer of the closed lid. The lake was a sheet of black glass, reflecting nothing but the void of the night. I had rented the cabin to escape the noise of the city, seeking a silence so profound it felt heavy. There were no streetlights for miles, no neighboring houses to anchor me to reality. It was just me, the cedar-walled shack, and the water that stretched out like an infinite, unblinking eye. On the heavy oak table in the center of the main room sat my most prized possession, a hand-drawn neighborhood map of a village that didn't actually exist. I had spent weeks sketching its winding cobblestone streets, tiny squares for houses, and jagged lines for rivers. It was a static world, frozen in ink. Or so I thought until the second night. I fell into a deep sleep, the rhythmic lap of water against the pier acting as a metronome. In the middle of the night, my phone vibrated on the bedside table. A sharp buzz cut through the silence. I blinked my eyes open, the room bathed in moonlight. The screen glowed with a notification. New login. Instagram, 4829. My heart skipped. I hadn't touched my phone. There were no other people in the house, yet something was entering my digital life from within these four walls. I sat up and looked toward the table. The map had changed. Where there had been a straight path leading to a small cottage, there was now a spiraling cul-de-sac of jagged lines. It hadn't just shifted, it had recalculated itself. I felt a prickle of unease on my neck. I closed my eyes again, drifting back into a shallow slumber. Another buzz. New login. Spotify, 9103. I sat up faster this time. The map was unrecognizable now. The streets were thickening, some becoming wide avenues, others narrowing into claustrophobic veins. They weren't just lines anymore. They looked like the wrinkles on an old face. I heard a sound, not a footstep, but a soft, wet sliding noise, like a piece of damp velvet being dragged across wood. I peered toward the table and saw it. It was low to the ground, barely reaching my knees. It had 4 sturdy legs that ended in wide, cushioned pads. But its body was the most peculiar thing I had ever witnessed. It didn't have fur in the traditional sense. Instead, its entire back was covered in thousands of tiny, fleshy eyelids. They were all closed at first, a sea of smooth, pinkish bumps. As it moved, these eyelids twitched and fluttered. It was a creature of constant perception, even when it wasn't looking. It didn't have a face like ours. It had a snout that ended in a cluster of sensory whiskers and a crown of those same tiny lids. It moved with a deliberate, heavy grace, its body undulating as the eyelids rippled across its skin. It was the architect. Every time I slept, it walked over the map and rearranged the reality of the paper. I watched it now, paralyzed in my chair. The creature moved toward the map with a slow, rhythmic gait. With every step it took, a new street appeared on the parchment. It didn't use its paws to draw. It simply pressed its chest against the paper, and the ink would bleed and reform under its weight. Buzz. New login. Gmail. 2274. The creature paused. One of the eyelids on its shoulder popped open, a tiny slit of gold light in the center of a pink rim. Then another opened, and then 10 more. The sound was like 1,000 microscopic shutters clicking into place at once. It wasn't just observing the map, it was tasting the geography. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. I realized that every time the creature added a street, it was also claiming a piece of my house. The cabin felt smaller. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of its movement. The entity turned its head toward me, and for the first time, I saw the primary lid, the one situated where a nose would be. It swung wide, revealing not a pupil or an iris, but a deep, swirling well of motion that looked like a miniature galaxy of spinning silk. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking in the vacuum of the lake's silence. The creature didn't speak, but it moved toward me. It didn't walk on the floor, it stepped onto my lap. Its weight was comforting yet heavy, like a warm stone wrapped in silk. As it sat there, its thousands of eyelids began to open one by one in a cascading wave from its tail to its head. Asterisk click. Click click. Click. Asterisk with every lid that opened. The map on the table underwent a violent transformation. The streets didn't just change, they exploded into complex webs, some curving into perfect circles, others branching like frost on a window pane. I realized then that it wasn't just redrawing a neighborhood. It was mapping me. I watched as the creature leaned its head against my chest. The eyelids on its crown began to blink in synchronization with my own heartbeat. On the map, a new street appeared, a long, winding path that led directly into a tiny, perfect square of ink. I felt a strange sense of peace as I watched it work, but then the phone buzzed again for the final time. New login. System. 0000. The creature froze. Every single one of its thousands of eyelids snapped open simultaneously. The sound was like a heavy door slamming in a cathedral. On the map, the ink bled outward until it covered every square inch of the paper, erasing the streets, the houses, and the rivers until there was only a solid, deep black. The creature stood up on my lap and turned its body toward the door of the cabin. It didn't move to go outside, it simply waited. The map was finished. My digital life had been accounted for. I looked at the creature, then back at the map, realizing that the last street it drew wasn't a road at all, it was a doorway. I closed my eyes and felt the creature's weight shift as it prepared to move into the black space on the paper. I realized with a jolt of terror why there were no other lights on the lake, because now the cabin wasn't just a place where I stayed, it was the very last piece of ground left in its growing world. I reached out to touch the creature's side, and as my fingers brushed its fur-like eyelids, they all fluttered shut at once. The silence returned, heavier than before. In the center of the room, I heard a faint sound from the map, not the sound of paper moving, but the sound of something small and wet breathing beneath the ink. I am still sitting in the chair, but when I look at my hands, they are starting to turn into fine, black lines. The creature has finished its work, and now it is inviting me to become part of the drawing. The Watcher in the Hull. For hours 12 minutes and 3 seconds, power at 88%. Internal pressure stable. External temperature -1 degree Celsius. Everything is silent except for the hum of the oxygen scrubbers. The hull feels thick, a titanium womb holding us against the crushing weight of the abyss. I am sitting in the pilot's chair, watching the sediment drift like underwater snow. For hours 15 minutes and 44 seconds, small anomaly detected. The wide-angle security camera mounted on the ceiling, the one we call the eye, gave a microscopic twitch. It wasn't caused by a current or a vibration from the engine. It felt intentional, as if the metal housing had suddenly decided to lean 3 degrees to the left. For hours 18 minutes and 22 seconds, I noticed something peculiar about the eye. When I looked up at it, it wasn't pointing at the center of the cabin where the main console sits. It was angled toward the far corner, a dark pocket of shadow where nothing but a spare oxygen tank resides. I reached out to rotate the dial manually, but the lens whirred and corrected itself back to that empty corner. For hours 25 minutes and 10 seconds, the silence is starting to feel heavy. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the presence of a feeling, a sense of being observed. I looked at the eye again. It had moved further into the corner, tracking something invisible in that void. For hours 33 minutes and 15 seconds, I stood up to check the pressure gauge on the far wall. As my body moved through the center of the cabin, I realized the eye was following me. It didn't just swivel, it tracked my movement with a smooth, fluid grace, like a predatory iris locking onto its prey. Every time I shifted my weight, the camera adjusted to keep my torso perfectly centered in its frame. For hours 42 minutes and 59 seconds, "Is anyone there?" I whispered. My voice felt thin against the thick glass of the porthole. The eye didn't blink, but it pivoted toward the sound of my voice, then slowly began to drift away from me again, returning to that empty corner. For hours 51 minutes and 20 seconds, something moved in the periphery of my vision. Not a large movement, just a ripple in the air. I turned my head quickly to see it. It was standing just outside the main light pool, near the ceiling beams. It was shaped like a human, but its anatomy was fundamentally scrambled. Its head sat where a right shoulder should be, protruding from the side of its torso like a blooming flower. Instead of arms, it had 3 sets of legs, thick and muscular like those of a crab, bursting from its ribcage and supporting its upright posture. Its skin wasn't smooth. It was textured like hammered copper, pitted with small, irregular bumps. For hours 58 minutes and 42 seconds, the creature didn't move toward me yet. It simply existed in the corner. However, I noticed that as I moved, the eye followed the creature rather than myself. Whenever I tried to look at it, it would retreat slightly further into the shadows, maintaining a perfect distance. 5 hours 10 minutes and 33 seconds. "Stop hiding," I commanded. The creature responded by shifting its weight. Its head, the one on its shoulder, swung around to face me. It had no traditional nose or ears. Instead, it had a series of vertical slits along its jawline that vibrated as it breathed. It didn't have eyes in the center of its face, but rather 2 glowing pits located at the very top of its forehead. 5 hours 15 minutes and 21 seconds. The creature took a step forward on its many legs. The sound was a rhythmic clicking against the metal floor. Asterisk, click-clack. Click-clack, asterisk. It moved with a strange, lopsided grace because of its asymmetrical head placement. It reached out with a limb that had 2 joints instead of 1, stretching toward my face. 5 hours 22 minutes and 14 seconds, I froze as it entered the light. Its body was elongated, almost stretched like taffy. The skin rippled, and I could see tiny gears-like structures moving beneath the copper surface, as if its internal organs were constantly reconfiguring themselves. It wasn't just walking, it was rearranging. 5 hours 30 minutes and 5 seconds, the eye suddenly swung wildly to the left, then right, then settled on a point directly above the creature's head. It was capturing something I couldn't see yet. A tiny floating speck of dust? Or perhaps something larger? 5 hours 41 minutes and 58 seconds. The creature opened its mouth wide, horizontal slit that spanned from ear to ear. From within, a sound emerged. It wasn't a roar or a hum. It was the sound of my own breathing, perfectly synchronized with mine, but echoed back with a slight, metallic reverb. 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 12 seconds. I felt a chill run down my spine. The creature reached out and touched the side of my helmet. Its skin felt like warm stone. It didn't have fingers so much as 3 blunt pads at the end of each limb. And 6 hours, 1 minute, and 34 seconds. Then, the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, the cabin plunged into total darkness. When the power surged back, the creature was gone from its corner. It was no longer standing on the floor. It was pressed against the ceiling, hovering upside down. 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 59 seconds. I looked up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The eye was also on the ceiling now, tilted at an impossible angle. It wasn't looking at the creature anymore. It was looking directly into my pupils. 6 hours, 30 minutes, and 45 seconds. Where did you come from? I asked, my voice trembling. The creature didn't answer with a sound this time. Instead, its head-shoulder rotated 180 degrees backward, revealing a secondary set of faces on the underside of its chin. They were small and circular, like buttons. 6 hours, 45 minutes, and 20 seconds. It began to descend slowly. Its many legs moved in a coordinated dance, clicking against the hull. With every inch it dropped, the eye followed it perfectly, zooming in until the copper skin and those vertical breathing slits filled the entire frame of my vision. 7 hours, 5 minutes, and 12 seconds. It stopped just inches from my face. I could smell it, a scent of wet minerals and old ozone. Its head-shoulder tilted toward me, and one of the small button faces on its chin blinked. 7 hours, 18 minutes, and 40 seconds. The creature opened its main mouth again. This time, it didn't mimic my breathing. It spoke in my own voice, but with a hollow, layered quality. I have been watching you from the corner, it said. 7 hours, 32 minutes, and 19 seconds. I reached out to touch its head-shoulder, but as my hand made contact, the creature's body suddenly went limp. It didn't fall. It folded inward like a collapsing telescope, shrinking until it was no larger than a grapefruit. 8 hours and 2 seconds. The lights died completely this time. I sat in the absolute blackness of the deep ocean, feeling the weight of the water above me and the stillness of the cabin around me. 8 hours, 15 minutes, and 44 seconds. A small click sounded from above. 8 hours, 16 minutes, and 20 seconds. The eye turned on with a soft hum, casting a thin beam of white light into the darkness. I looked up to see the creature, now fully extended again, hanging directly over me. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting for me to close my eyes. 8 hours and 30 minutes. The camera panned slowly to the right, away from the creature, toward the empty porthole where the void of the ocean stretched out forever. I realized then that the creature wasn't an inhabitant of the seafloor. It was a guest of the hull, and it had finally decided to stop watching and start participating. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.